Please welcome Cory Mendell.
Everybody stand up. Stand up. Stand up. We're going to do 3 jumping jacks. Okay, 1, 2, 3. 1.
Oh, you should have done that.
3. All right. It's nothing to do with rewriting. It's just it's good sitting. How many of you have heard that writing is rewriting? Raise your hand. How many of you have ever read a script by someone who didn't know this, or someone, a friend in a class, a writing group, someone really didn't know how to rewrite? They wrote something, kind of that first draft, they fell in love with it, they did a little bit of tweaking, and they're like, this is great! And you read it, and you realize, man, rewriting is really important. Raise your hand if you've read that experience. And how many of you honestly feel like you're not as good at rewriting as you need to be? How many of you struggle with rewriting? Okay. Does anyone have like a chronic issue that comes up a lot when they're rewriting? Yeah. Avoidance.
Going to the movies, going to the beach.
Okay, so that's less about rewriting, that's more about procrastination. Read the War of Art. Any other that comes up specifically with rewriting?
Maybe focusing on like one thing on the past and kind of start reading it all and you're changing.
And you get overwhelmed, great.
I just want to rewrite.
You want to rewrite, right. So how do you stop? How do you know? How do you guide yourself through the rewriting process? I want to share something that when I was starting out, and I was in film school, and I was like a million people just trying to break in the business. I was lucky to intern for a manager. And, we all come to writing with certain inherent strengths and weaknesses. Rewriting was my biggest weakness. And there was no way I was even going to have a chance at a career if I didn't get better at it. And he taught me something really profound about rewriting that literally, had he not taught it to me, I'd be sitting there watching someone else move around. I never would have had a career. So what he taught me was the way most people go about rewriting is really silly. You take a script and you give it to people you trust and you say, please read it, be honest with me. What's working, what's not working, where is it slow, how can I change it? You solicit feedback. You don't necessarily do all of it, but you filter through, pick the feedback that makes the most sense, and you rewrite it. And he said, don't do that. And I'm like, what's the alternative, And he said, here's the thing, Cory, when you write a script, you experience a movie. A movie plays in your head, and you feel this movie. And when you give it to a writer, or a reader, and she reads it, she experiences a movie. And you experience a movie, and you experience a movie, and you experience a movie. Now I'm going to sit down and talk about it. The underlying assumption is that we all experience roughly the same movie. And he said, writers would be shocked if they knew the truth. So cut about a year and a half later, I broke into business, and Ridley Scott's going to make my movie, so UCLA said, do you want to teach? I said, sure. So I teach screenwriting for the first time, and this is what I did. I thought I was going to win an award. So I'm like, Luke, bring in 10 copies of your script. And your name is? Mark, you bring in 10 copies of, it's actually 7 copies, switch. Luke, you have 7 copies of my script. Go to 7 of your friends, say, I didn't write the script. This guy in my class, I don't even know him. Seems like a nice guy, but I don't know him. Read the script. So that people reading your script don't know you, don't care about you, they're not rooting for you, they're not rooting against you, blank slate. And tell your friends, you don't have to have anything intelligent to say. I'm going to ask you questions about the movie that played in your head. And you're going to ask them about 35 to 45 minutes worth of questions and record it. And you're going to do the same thing with 7 of your friends. Next week in class, give me your recordings, switch. Now you have 7 recordings from 7 strangers who read your script. And I say, Luke, go home and not only listen to the recordings, because that's too easy, you have to transcribe them. Because then you really have to hear them. And I thought, Teacher of the Year award, here I come. 2 of my students literally called to threaten that they were going to kill themselves. And it wasn't funny at the time. They're both working writers today, and they both said this was the first time they understood what it meant, or the first time they actually understood what the game was. I had one woman just disappear. Like, she paid all this money for this program, and she just went MIA for like 6 weeks. It is devastating when you have spent all this time and energy writing something that you love, and when you read it, this is what you experience, and you suddenly realize that everybody else is experiencing this. And this is never anywhere in the ballpark of what you want it to be. It's the biggest kick in the whatever is your most sensitive anatomy. And the tragedy is that most writers aren't taught this. And so it's literally like they I mentor at Film Independent, and I work with a woman, and they bring in, these amazing directors and producers of Crash and Blue Valentine and her hero. And she said something to me I hear all the time. 5 people read my script and gave me notes, and it was like they had read a different script. And their notes didn't actually line up. How many of you ever had that experience? Because they read 5 different scripts. Because what I was taught is the job of a writer is learn how to write your material so that when total strangers read it, they see and experience the movie you did. Then and only then do you want to know what they think and suggestions and criticism. But skipping that first step makes the feedback irrelevant. It's almost like you gave 5 copies of your script to friends, but accidentally it switched. It was a different script and you didn't realize it. And they gave you notes on some other script, and you rewrote your script to those notes. It's absolutely ridiculous. This was the most profound thing anybody taught me because it makes you realize what the objective is. The first objective is developing the skill set so that you can write a draft that other people can see and experience the movie you can. And you're not going to be a professional writer if you can't do that. And so then the question is, how come most writers can't do that? So, a couple reasons. In Encino, they have this secret warehouse where every script that's ever failed goes to die. It's not really true, but go with me. So it's a huge warehouse. And imagine I have a forklift, and I get all of the scripts that principally failed because it was terrible writing, like on the nose, everyone's just saying what they're feeling, and it's just terrible writing. And you can tell within 4 pages, and a professional reader is done. And I take all those scripts and I pile them over here. Raise your hand if you suspect this would be a pretty large pile. Raise your hand. Okay. And now let's say I get the forklift and I go get all the scripts where one of the main reasons they failed is the movie that the writer experienced is so much stronger and richer than the movie that the reader experienced. And I put this pile over here. How many of you suspect this is also a sizable pile? Raise your hand. Great. So now here's the question. Which pile is bigger? We'll vote. How many people think this pile is bigger? How many people think this pile is bigger? I can guarantee without I've done so many script consultations, I was a studio reader, I can tell you unambiguously this pile is so much bigger. Now, writers know they shouldn't write on the nose, and most writers, not all writers, know they have to be clear in their writing. What are most writers more concerned about? That. So most writers are concerned about that, and most writers are failing because of that. Here's the reason this pile is bigger. Most people, when you start out, if you write on the nose, you're told that's terrible writing. You know that. And you go, oh, okay. And you read that, and you go, oh, I don't want to sound like that writer, and I better knock it off. And most writers, early on, realize, I have to avoid this. Most writers go year in and year out writing scripts that fail without knowing they're in this pile, because no one tells them that. So that's why this pile is so much bigger, because writers don't know how to avoid it, or don't even know they're in that pile. If there was a law that you had to test your scripts before you went to the marketplace, testing means what movie plays in other people's minds, the whole game would be different. Because people would say, why am I in this pile? And the reason you're in this pile is because most writers don't know how to write in compelling conflict. In his book, Rewrites, Neil Simon talks about the years that he wrote play after play, that he poured his heart and soul into characters and dialogue, and they weren't good enough. And he knew they weren't good enough, but he didn't know why. How many of you have written, you know it's not quite good enough, and honestly, you're not entirely sure why? Raise your hand. It's a terrible feeling. Nobody wants to do, which is he went to his older brother, Dan, who was a successful writer, and he said, help me. And Danny read his stuff and said, you don't write in conflict. And he said, of course I do, what are you talking about? And then Danny taught him. In his book, he said, once I understood how to write in conflict, then I knew how to write in clarity, and all I had to do was build the conflict and then just add the dialogue. So in my estimation, about 90% to 95% of writers don't write in conflict. And so because of that, no one's going to see the movie that plays in your head. So the notes that you solicit on the rewriting process, you're just chasing your tail. It's a whack-a-mole. The most important thing you can do is learn how to write in conflict, learn how to write in strong context. Because most writers, this is their choice. I'll write where everyone's saying what they're feeling and give all the information and the stakes, and oh, I'm a hack. Or I'll stop doing that, and I'll write it sort of more subtly and in subtext. And I swear to God, when I do a script consult with a non-professional writer, I always start with, tell me the movie that plays in your head. Why do you love these characters? Why do you love the story? What happens? Why does it happen? Walk me through your experience. And every single time, it concludes with me saying, that is so much more interesting than the experience I had and other people have reading your script. Let me help you learn how to bridge that gap. That's what the manager taught me to do. And the most important tool is conflict and context. And if you want more information on that, go to my website. There's a bunch of free information. It's corymendell.net. I bought some cards, fancy. If you guys want to pass out, you go to my website. So that's the most important thing I can teach you is test your material to know what movie plays in other people's heads. Because this happens a lot. I'll do a script consult with someone and I'll read their script and it'll be pretty good, then it'll be pretty good, and then I'll get to like page 80 and it's just terrible. It's like their evil twin wrote the ending. And this always happens. I ask them what happened. They're like, yeah, that wasn't my original ending, but I gave it to my writing group, I worked with a consultant, or my friends, or whomever, and they hated the ending, it didn't work, and I go back and read the original script, and it's terrible, the ending. And then I say, walk me through the movie that plays in your head. And I realize their original ending was gold. No one's experiencing it. So they didn't fix the problem, they fixed the symptom of the problem. Instead of learning how to rewrite it so people could experience their ending, they took the best ending and threw it away and wrote a different ending that didn't work as well. So you want to make sure that you're dealing with the problem, not the consequences of the problem. The other thing that makes rewriting so hard for people is they don't understand their writing process, and so they keep making the same mistakes over and over without realizing it. And that's why rewriting becomes so frustrating. So here's an example. I was working with a writer, she was Australian, and she knew, and it was true, that her first 20 or 30 pages were just stellar, but she couldn't get the middle to work. The middle was always slow, and she knew that, and she kept rewriting it over and over. She spent a year rewriting it, and she didn't think it was any better, and it wasn't any better. And this was like the 5th time this has happened, and she just couldn't rewrite middles of scripts to make them strong. So in getting to know her as a writer, I talked about escalations. Escalations are when you're writing the script or rewriting the script, things are either getting harder for your main character, they're staying the same, or they're getting easier. And the first one's interesting, and the second two are not. And she was really good about creating character and situation and got interested and involved, but then nothing really happened, it sort of flatlined. And so we talked about escalations, and she said, well, what would you do if you were rewriting my script? And if I was a student, I wouldn't answer that and make them figure it out, but since it's a consult, I would. And I said, well, given your characters and given what your script's about, from an organic point of view, this is what I would start thinking about in terms of escalations, and I laid them out. She goes, I had the impulse to do all of those, but I didn't. And okay, that's interesting. Can you give me a previous script? And she did. And I said, can you tell me what impulses you had to do in the middle that you didn't? And she did, and those were perfect. So now I realized what her problem was. It wasn't that she couldn't escalate, it's that she stopped herself. She kept blocking herself. And until she could figure out why she did that, she was going to be in rewriting hell for the rest of her life. So I got to know her, and it became quite clear what was going on. She's a deeply intuitive writer. You have conceptual writers and intuitive writers. She's a deeply intuitive writer. She feels her characters. They are real people to her. She loves them, and she has a maternal instinct to protect them. And that's why the middles of her scripts weren't good. She went to all these programs, she learned all these formulas. Hopefully you guys understand, if you write to a formula, no agent or manager will take you seriously. The formulas are a well-traveled path to failure. Her problem was in her process. And so I worked with her to overcome that. Now she has 2 movies in production, one in Australia, one here. Another guy that I worked with, he gets the story and the set pieces, but he can't get his characters to pop. And he rewrites them over and over and over, and there's all this stuff, and he gets lost and all the stuff to rewrite his characters, and he never can get there. He's the opposite of her. He was a very conceptual writer. And the conceptual side of us invents and creates characters. And so the characters are like puppets to a reader. And he rewrote from a conceptual place, so just made it worse. The more he rewrote, the more the life got squeezed out. And what he had to learn to do was how to turn off the conceptual part of him and work from a pure intuitive place. And then suddenly rewriting became much more manageable and much more successful. So when people complain about rewriting, rewriting is often not the problem. Think about a river and there's a factory that's polluting and there's a village where kids are getting sick. So you come in, you keep helping the kids, they keep getting sick, you help the kids, because the sick kids aren't the problem, it's the consequences. The problem is the factory. And so you take the factory offline, kids are going to keep being sick. The sick factory, or the sick village, that's your rewriting. Rewriting isn't inherently difficult, but it's virtually impossible if you don't have the fundamental tools. So you need to learn to write a conflict, and you need to understand your process, and you need to understand what your habitual mistakes are. And you need to understand why you're making those habitual mistakes. And then, I have 5 minutes, so 5 minutes? Okay. The last thing I want to say, and then I'll take questions, is too many people confuse editing with rewriting, or polishing with rewriting. The writers that I know who have careers that I work with, they're very strategic when it comes to rewriting. So what I suggest is when you have a draft, now hopefully you know how to write a conflict, hopefully you've tested it to know who you place under people's heads, but when it comes time to rewrite, make a list of all the things that you think you need to improve in this draft. And that's going to make it less overwhelming and make you less want to go to the movies. Just make a list of all the things. And then when you rewrite, just address one of them per rewrite, but pick the right one. Pick the fundamental, what is the one that's causing all the other problems? Most people try to fix everything at once, and it's an unsolvable equation. Or they get obsessed with rewriting from an intuitive place, and they keep tweaking without any understanding of the conceptual objectives. Rewriting isn't usually the problem is upstream. Any questions? Yes?
How do you know when you're done?
How do you know when you're done? Great question. So, this is the answer that I was given when I was starting out. When 6 or 7 people who don't know anything about what you intend read your script, and the movie that plays in their head is very similar to the movie that you experienced, you're done. Now, at that point, you certainly might ask for suggestions or improvements, and at that point, it now becomes personal taste, and you can decide to do that or not. But what happens is 99% of scripts that are submitted to the industry, the movie that plays in the writer's head is not the movie that plays in the reader's head. And so most writers are constantly getting rejected on scripts they never wrote. And the reality is, what would have happened if people could have experienced their movie? We'll never know. So most people when they write take effect. They have a voice in their head that looks over their shoulder and says, this is good, this is bad. And I'll write till that voice says it's good. That voice is very unreliable. And writing to that voice is where writing becomes stale and overwrought and loses life. Intuitive writers are great at putting all the life into their scripts, but nobody can experience it. Conceptualist writers tend to be clear, but there's no life in it. That's why you have to integrate the two. Any other questions? Yes? No? Okay. Yes?
How can you become more of like an intuitive writer if you're more of a...
Creative integration, again, go to my website, because I could spend an hour on that. We don't have an hour, and I can also answer questions. But basically, what's your name?
Andy.
Andy, you just put your finger on the question that people should be asking themselves. Because in this industry, if you want to succeed, talk to any agent or manager, you have to write scripts that have amazing characters and an amazing story. There are a lot of writers who get half of the equation, and they don't have careers, not in this marketplace. Great story, characters. Great characters, story. Gotta have great book. That's creative integration. The conceptual part has a different value system and a different processor, and it's a sequential processor than the intuitive. So the conceptual side is where structure comes from, and the intuitive side is where characters and dialogue come. Okay, so you have to have both of them. Here's the biggest mistake that writers make, and of course they make it, which is every time you write a script, You want to write a script that's the best possible script. The script that has the best chances of getting an agent or a manager or selling, or nothing else, having your friends in writing group say, hey, I think you have a shot. I don't think you're wasting your time here. That's what everyone wants to do. And that's why there's such a huge failure rate. Because when you write that script, you're going to write to your strengths and hide your weaknesses. Which means over time, your strengths become stronger and stronger, and your weaknesses become weaker and weaker. So creative integration is, let's not focus on product, let's focus on process. That was my big paradigm shift as a teacher at UCLA about 4 years ago, and I've seen my success rate go from 3% to 40%. And so what creative integration is, we're going to write to your weakness and hide your strength. I'm not going to show it to the industry. This is called writer development. We're going to do writer development before we actually start writing scripts for the industry. So basically, if you're a conceptual writer, I would make you tie that hand behind your back. I'd give you a series of exercises that would force you to work from a pure intuitive place until you could literally write from a pure trance-like intuitive place with no conceptual intervention. And then comes the hard part. That's not the hard part. That's hard. The hard part is integrating the two back together so that they work in harmony. And once you do that, actually rewriting becomes a much more manageable perspective. Because here's the thing about what you need for a rewrite. At any point, you have to ask yourself, what's best for my story? What would my character really do? Okay. Or they do this, what's best for my story? Okay, I'll go there. They sacrifice their characters for their plot and their story and their set pieces and their comedy and their horror and their great moments. And intuitive writers sacrifice their story for their characters. If you want to be a professional writer, you can't sacrifice either. And that requires creative integration. And that's why you have so many writers who are writing year after year after year, and they hit like a ceiling. And that ceiling isn't high enough for them to break into the business, because they're good at half of it, but not the other half. And the worst thing is people who aren't good at characters and dialogue, they take classes and read books, and that's just conceptual tools. Which is, it's like literally, I'm not good at hammering. Well, here's a straw. Go home and hammer with a straw. It's not going to work. It's the wrong tool. It's a really profoundly important question. Any other questions? Blah, I have to live up to. Any other questions? Everything's crystal clear? All right.
Can I follow up with that?
Yeah, you
So
should.
it almost seems like you're, first, when you're creating the outline structure, you're doing the conceptual.
No.
I mean,
that, you know what, and I'm glad you said that too. This is something that drives me crazy. I've been on so many panels with people that say, you have to outline. You know, there's people who outline and break their story. How many of you have heard there's people who outline and break their story, and then there's amateurs? How many of you have heard a version of that? Raise your hand. Okay. Well, when I was in an unwritten script that I broke in industry with, I didn't outline. 3 of my last 4 students who just sold scripts, 2 of them for quite a bit of money, they didn't outline. Now, it would be arrogant and erroneous for me to say, I didn't outline, so you shouldn't outline. No, you've got to find your own process. Here's what I found. Most conceptual writers do their best work when they start very intuitively. Quentin Tarantino did. And most intuitive writers do their best work when they start very conceptually, but non-formulaic. And most writers do the opposite. They stay inside their comfort zone. So there is no one-size-fits-all process. And we all have a natural process that we use to create material. And it's probably not the process that allows us to create our best material. So one of the things I do when I work with writers is once they learn the tools, now we go to process experimentation. You're going to bring in 10 pages, like a little 10-page mini movie using this process, this process, this process, and this process. Because I'm not smart enough to know which process creates your best work, and you're not smart enough to know. So we're going to try them all and match outcome to process. And invariably, it's the process that the writer didn't want to do, or when they did it, they said, these pages are terrible, that everyone says this is amazing. True story. So I have this guy, Cory, and he was a very intuitive writer. And so he got to he was putting us off, but there was the very conceptual process, and he didn't want to do that, but he did. And this happens all the time. He calls me up and he goes, I can't bring these pages in. I go, Cory, you made a contract to do this. He goes, they're so bad. I go, it's a group. You're saying, I can't. I'm like, okay, here's your choice. You show up tonight with the pages for everyone to read it, or you're out of the group. So he shows up and he gives the pages and he starts to qualify. Shut up, Gary, sit down. So everyone reads the pages, and everyone's like, Gary, this is the best thing you ever wrote. And he said, no, you're all wrong. You're all wrong. And he got really upset. Long story short, he got so excited, he showed it to his agent, this like 15-page talking lobster piece that he wrote with this like 15 pages with talking lobsters. And his agent said, this is the best writing you've ever done, but what do you expect me to do with it? And Gary's like, I don't know, I had to show it to you. So Gary comes in 3 weeks later, I'm meeting with Ryan Fraser. Kind of imagine it. My agent was talking to someone, he showed someone, imagine my pages, it went up the food chain, they don't know what to do with it, they love it, they want to meet. Right? Gary now has a team of CAA agents. That's a great thing when someone says, who's your agent? Well, I have a team of CAA agents. But here's the thing, he was that close to not coming in. That's why, I brought on a different subject, that's why process work is so hard. Because if you try a different process, read your pages, and you say, I'll evaluate if those pages are good or not, I know the outcome. You'll just stay rooted in your natural default process. You'll never find a better process. You need to do this in conjunction with people you trust who can look at your work. But you can't do process work until you're strong intuitively and conceptually, and that takes training. All right, guys, so we are out of time. You have my card, you can email me, there's information on my website. I'll duck out there, and if anyone wants to ask me any more questions, I'll be out there for a few minutes.
Cory, Mendell, everyone.